I was with some friends and this stranger got a Vimcal logo tattooed on his right thigh. He just pulls down his pants to the ankles. One of the best moments of the last 6 years.
Welcome to Tank Talks, a podcast that brings you insights and stories from some of the best and brightest minds in technology and investing. I'm your host, Matt Cohen, founder and managing partner at Ripple Ventures. On this week's episode, we welcome the CEO and co-founder of Vimcal, John Lee, to discuss how John and his co-founder survived their first few pivots at YC and finally emerged with success on their third try. John shares his journey working at Apple and Twitter before launching his first augmented reality startup that was accepted into Y Combinator, and how he was quickly told his startup would fail just ahead of demo day. John provides a candid look into what his experience was like pivoting just ahead of demo day, and the journey he and his co-founder went through in order to keep the company alive. Finally, John shares why relentless customer feedback and product focus helped Vimcal become so loved by all of its users, even to the point where one rabid user got a Vimcal tattoo on their body. But before we jump into this week's interview, we welcome back to the Tank John Ruffalo to discuss the news and stories making headlines in the tech and venture capital ecosystem. Oh, welcome back to the Tank, John. How was your weekend?
Great weekend.
Well, we got a lot to cover here, so let's jump right in here. So it's a big week here. We've got the federal budget coming out tomorrow. We're recording this on Monday. I'm going to save that for a little bit because there was a lot of talk over the weekend, besides everything going obviously in the Middle East and the belligerent war that Iran is trying to obviously take control of with no success. The other thing that was feeding my Twitter feed was all the stuff regarding the public sector and the productivity or lack of productivity that's reshaping Canada. So let's start off with this. To set the stage, there were some reports and there was an article written in the Globe and Mail over the weekend by Jason Kirby talking about how the public sector has been reshaping Canada's economy and how the number of workers in Canada's public sector has soared in recent years, outpacing the private sector. And obviously, this is causing a lot of concern around the private citizenship and obviously entrepreneurship. And so obviously, to set the stage, we had obviously a bunch of years leading into the global pandemic where public service was obviously required. A lot of emergency responders were taking on to the public sector. And we really haven't seen that fall off much now that we sort of have moved past the pandemic. So I want to get your thoughts here. You know, we're starting to see a lot of pushback as we're heading into a federal election next year. What are your thoughts on this and how the public is reacting to this?
Well, I think the public's reacting to the actual data. And when I saw that chart too, it was a far greater spread in the growth of the public sector than I even had imagined. Despite some comments to the contrary, this is not a path to a higher standard of living and productivity, where some pundits had even said, well, if you fire a lot of these public servants, unemployment goes up and blah, blah. It's like, come on. This is ridiculous. This is coming out of taxpayer money. This is not productive jobs. The other pattern I would say, and this has been a public policy matter really for the last 8 or 9 years, is it feels like a lot of the public policy is supporting individuals to work for either companies or the public sector. Again, much more concerned about the public sector, as opposed to entrepreneurship and taking risks. When you look at taxation policy, it feels like there is the taxing of success. And again, they're not saying that, but I think the public reaction is, we've been seeing this all along. And while during that pandemic, you're right, it did spike. The double whammy is not only has it not been reduced consequentially, but most of these workers are actually remote and their actual productivity has fallen off a cliff as well, because many of them are nowhere to be found. So this is a troubling situation for Canada. And this is why lots of folks are demanding small government, because this is where our taxpayer dollars are landing. Yeah,
I mean, the chart that you're referring to, which was sourced from Stats Canada, obviously Globe and Mail calculations back from 2014, the growth of the public sector versus private sector and then self-employed were kind of in lockstep, if you look, going all the way up until 2019. But as soon as the pandemic started in 2020, the private sector went negative 15%, self-employed kind of trailed down to 0%, but the public sector soared to over 25% by 2024. The CRA grew by 34% in 2019. The Employment and Social Development Canada grew by 56% since 2019. I mean, the irony around all of this is that employment and social development are the largest employers in Canada, 45,000 people to be exact, which is twice as much as Rogers Communication employees, and I'm sure way larger than some of Canada's biggest, private enterprises. So I guess the other question is, we saw this AI budget or this AI plan come out the other week. The funny part is none of it, hopefully, it comes this way, but it doesn't feel like any of it is going to automate or reduce the size of public sector jobs, given that you see a huge growth here. That's where it should be probably spent. Give $100 million, let's say, to 10 companies over the course of 3 years to solve some of the inefficiencies we have in government productivity, and you'll get a lot more bang for your buck than continue to grow the public sector, don't you think?
Absolutely. And, one of the narrative that, Matt, you and I have chatted about is over the last decade, when people would talk about the growth of their business, a lot of the times they would talk it in terms of people growth and adding employment. With AI, the narrative should be holding your employee count, if not decreasing it. And yet we're seeing the complete opposite here on our taxpayer dollars. So I think this is the election issue, and I think a lot of people are very, very frustrated about it.
Right. And so the other piece people were talking about was the productivity or lack of productivity we're seeing in Canada. I mean, the stats that came out says that Canada, of the G7 countries, has the highest real housing prices, soaring over 300% versus France, United States, Italy, Germany, Britain, Japan. That's kind of crazy to hear that. Also, the Canada per GDP decline into Q4 is negative versus the rest of the other countries. And the standard of living is declining in Canada versus the US. The US standard of living, I think, was last, maybe calculated around 116, real GDP per capita versus Canada, which is going almost down into the negatives, slower growing economy of the OECD countries. It's predicted that Canada will be the worst performing advanced economy over the next 10 years. Leading into this budget conversation, what are you expecting? Because all we're hearing is tax hikes and more money to spend on the public sector.
I'm curious what it's going to be. So far, all the pre-news is all goodies being handed out. This alliance with the NDP, I think, is just pulling the Liberals even further left of the spectrum. I'm not sure there's much room left there. And someone has to pay for it. And, what does drive me nuts is, at the end of the day, fairness and paying taxes is fairness for all. And if they do proceed with the threat of either wealth taxes or increasing already, we have the second highest income tax rate in the world. And when you layer on property taxes or commodity taxes, we are the number one tax country in the world. The folks who have the easiest ability to be mobile will leave the country. And if you think that's an idle threat, I haven't heard this amount of discussion in the last 3, 4, 5 years, and I've had in my entire career. And that's not only the wealthiest, it's also the young kids who are graduating. So this is the future of Canada, and we really need to be very careful in the direction that we're going.
I don't think it's an idle threat at all. Obviously, we know that the Liberals and, the NDP are going after that millennial Gen Z vote, with more spending, more loan forgiveness or initiatives addressing that demographic while putting affordability and housing, center stage, which obviously benefits first-time home buyers, people trying to get into, the cities to live, versus maybe a bit more of the middle-aged population who have more savings, who have more wealth, and they're going to be taxed and not getting anything for it. We saw $38 billion in new initiatives announced in the last week or so, leading up into the $17 billion of which was through loan programs. Where are they going to make up this shortfall? And to be honest, I don't think it comes anywhere else besides higher taxes, which is going to be a lot of concern, especially for entrepreneurs too, who are becoming wealthy. So speaking of which, it sounds like Toby at Shopify was ahead of the game on how to incentivize some of their corporate employees to get paid. Did you see the news on Amazon the other week? So they're now giving mid and lower level corporate employees a chance to decide how much they want to tie their future pay to company stock performance. If you remember, last year, Toby had that sliding scale where employees can choose how much they wanted in stock versus cash. Well, now Amazon is following their lead. Amazon will give many US corporate employees the option of reducing the amount of stock they receive quarter by quarter in exchange for more cash. We're following the leads of Tesla and Shopify. What are your thoughts and takeaways for this?
Well, I mean, Amazon was notoriously paying their employees relatively lower than other companies because the stock price gains were so substantive. But now that, what's Amazon, $2 trillion or thereabouts in market cap, I wonder if Andy Jassy rightfully is saying, how much more could this go? And if you're an employee, you're going to start to say, you know what? That equity growth is probably going to go in one direction. It's not going to go up. So I would rather take my cash comp is probably the reaction, where I don't see the same reaction on earlier stage companies where you can still make a substantive gains on the value of your equity.
Yeah, speaking of Andy Jassy, in 2022, he had $317,000 roughly in cash earnings. The rest of it was all from stock. So it feels like these people are either realizing their stocks are kind of tapping out and they want to keep their talent happy. And they're acting more like Series A startups where they're short on cash, but happy to give away more ESOP shares. It's just funny to see some of the wealthiest companies in the world reverting back to this more, cash options conversation. And last but not least, speaking of investments, you had some big news today in the news with a lead investment along with TELUS and a company called Code Labs. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, this investment actually goes back about 6 or 7 years ago when I was at Omer's Ventures, and we were looking at the building industry. And, because of our relationship with Oxford, one of the biggest issues that was preventing the efficiencies of operating the buildings and also the connectivity to the smart city. You cannot build a smart city if you don't have smart buildings first. And then the smart buildings connect to one another, and then they connect to the infrastructure, and that's how you get a smart city. But the very first step was a problem. And all of the equipment in the buildings, they would never talk to each other on purpose because no one would want to hand over the keys to their competitors in the building. So this was a stalemate for many, many years. And these two brothers that are based in Detroit, they actually responded to a thesis document that Peter Haas on our team had sent out saying, hey, you guys said that you're looking for a company that does this. We do this. We actually didn't believe them and have been following the story. And all of a sudden, now we're seeing the biggest commercial building owners in the world start to realize, oh my God, this thing here is doing exactly what it intended to do. So we're pretty excited. And, the interesting story of these brothers is that they were refugees when the war in Kosovo broke out. And what I didn't know is that Detroit has one of the biggest Kosovar populations in the world outside of Kosovo.
That's amazing. Yeah, you don't see many startups, Series B startups coming out of Detroit, Michigan, but that explains it, And also given your time at Omer's and then obviously with everything that went on with Sidewalk Labs, this is the way that technology should have been applied. It just wasn't, maybe the right time, but it shows that one, putting your thesis out there for the world to consume brings in opportunities that you've now obviously been able to take advantage of. And you're right. I mean, you talk about the company's success. They're on track to reach 20 million US in revenue, 200% growth since 2021 and working with some pretty big name Canadian real estate giants, Oxford Properties, BCI, Omer's, Hines, Ford, GWL. So what do we expect to see from companies like this? And how does this, impact Maverick's views of investing in, I guess, climate tech?
Yes. So this is consistent with our theme on you're absolutely saying it's at the intersection of both our smart city theme. MyoVision was our first one. And this is continuing to complete the picture. We have other components on establishing our thesis and what we love. Their hottest selling module is the requirements to report GHG emissions. And the biggest problem is that the number one tool that was being used was Excel spreadsheets from equipment to equipment. This actually does this from the push of a button. So the timing is the market wasn't ready years ago. It is ready now.
Absolutely. Well, excited to see how this comes, to a doorstep near you. But thanks for sharing, and we'll get a touch base after the federal budget comes out next week, John. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, Matt.
Now let's jump into the tank for this week's episode with John Lee, the CEO and co-founder of Vimcal. Thanks for jumping the tank today, John.
Good to be with you, Matt. Thanks for having me.
John, your journey as an entrepreneur is quite common, but not often one talked about and discussed in the tech world. But before we jump into your current role, it would be great if you give our listeners a bit of background on your early career days before launching your current startup, so our listeners get a sense of who you are and where you came from.
Before running Vimcal, I worked full-time as a software engineer, first at a startup. That was right after college. I was there for about 6 months. It was in the HR space. And then we got acquired by Twitter, and I was at Twitter for 2 years before jumping the ship and going full-time with the startup. And then way back in college, I did an internship stint at Apple, which I would say shaped a lot of the ways I think about product.
You did a few internships I saw at Apple. What was the different roles you had during your time at Apple?
One internship, but over 3 years. So 3 summers, and then I worked part-time during the year as well.
Did you get to see any exciting products that are now in market?
It's funny because we had these intern all hands. And I remember at one all hands, they said, one of the VPs said, yeah, Apple will never make the iPhone waterproof. We have to we have to really focus. We have to, do what we do well. We shouldn't look at what Samsung is doing. And then I think 2 years later, they made that iPhone partially waterproof or something.
Yeah, people still don't believe that it is waterproof now with iPhone 15 or something, but it is waterproof.
Oh yeah, I've dropped it in the sink more times than I like to admit, and it's still fine.
Fantastic. And then so you spent 2 years at Twitter. What was that like? Obviously pre-Elon days. Who was running it then? Was it still Jack?
It was Jack. Jack had just taken over, I believe. So it was 2016 to 2018. And it was a very interesting time because that was during the elections. Basically, as everyone knows, Twitter and most companies in SF is a pretty left-leaning organization. In terms of the employee makeup, DJT was the one that was basically paying the bills. So everyone had a lot of mixed feelings. So it was very interesting because we would go to work and there would always be rallies and protests in front of the office. It seems like most people within the company agreed with the protest, but they still had to keep chugging along and they still had to keep all the accounts open. And I remember I got pinged on call once just for that issue. And it was 3 a.m. because something happened with, one of the political accounts. And it was a pretty hectic time.
That's incredible. Yeah. I mean, you were right at the start of sort of the 2016 election, obviously the Hunt and Biden, and now with what we've seen with Twitter files, all the suppression. But you're right. The bills were being paid by people that the employees did not necessarily agree with or want to support, but they wanted to keep their jobs. Funny enough, they ended up all probably getting fired when Elon took over, but you can't really predict the future that way. So interesting time. So what ended up happening? What was the aha moment that made you really want to launch your first startup?
I remember I was having dinner once with my now co-founder, Mike. We were buddies from college. I think we met his freshman year. I'm a year older, and we met playing basketball, and we took a bunch of computer science classes together, and we were always project partners. After graduation, I hadn't seen him for a couple months, and we just decided to catch up. And we both were at big companies. I was at Twitter then, and he was at Microsoft. And I think we just both felt that work was fine. We were learning a lot, but also it was a slightly slower pace because we were both at big companies. So we just agreed to work on a side project together. And we didn't know what. We're let's just learn something. And it just so happened to be virtual reality was the big thing at the time, 2016. On nights and weekends, we'd hack on virtual reality side projects. And I think the first one we made, we wrote the code at a hackathon in the Bolt office, a fintech startup. I think when there were sub 10 people, it was very early. I think we made a VR beer pong game. It was just something like very silly. It was like called Galaxy Beer Pong. But from then on, we just realized that we just really liked working with each other. And we had worked with each other for a long time throughout college, but I guess we just kind of forgot for a bit at that point. And we're like, oh yeah, let's keep doing this. It started with VR. And then the next thing, we were making AR games and then coming up with like company ideas in the AR space, so augmented reality. And in 2017, we decided to build an ad network for AR. So kind of what banner ads are for Google or whatnot. We wanted to do that for AR. We applied to YC, got rejected. Applied again 6 months later, got in, and that was a once in a lifetime opportunity. So we took the jump.
That's amazing. So you worked with Ryan Breslow's office at Bolt, I guess, for a little bit. That must have been a really interesting time. The twists and turns that got you to where you eventually landed YC in the summer of 2018 with an AR idea. It sounds like it started with the infatuation with the technology, but obviously you wanted to build a business, which meant you had to find a problem to solve. What was the problem you initially thought you were solving with the first idea you had?
If you think about any AR app, you're basically looking through the world with a phone camera or, in the best case scenario, goggles. And let's say you're playing Pokemon Go or some other game where you have something pop up in your living room. How do you advertise then, right? Because traditional advertising on mobile phones is a banner ad, but you're using a camera. So whatever you show as an advertisement has to be native to your living room, the playground you're in, whatever. So we built an SDK for developers where they can basically install our software package, and we would natively show ads in the end user's environment. So if you're pointing to a wall, we'll show you like a Disney ad or something, like as like a little poster on the wall or something on the ground, or maybe a 3D little, I don't know, Mickey Mouse pops up and starts running around. Just all these different ways where in the 3D environment, you can show native ads. So that was our initial idea. I still think it was a good idea. It was just way too early. Someone else would do that one day.
Yeah, someone else will do it. So you did YC summer 2018 with the AR idea, but then you graduated with another idea in the fitness space. What was that transition like, that pivot? And how did your demo day and fundraising go?
Pretty bad, but I'll get to that. I remember we got into YC, and on the first day of what's called orientation, we were all really ecstatic, really happy. I remember at the end, after all the partners gave their talks, they told us about the dinners, everything, and we were all walking out to our cars, and our partner, or one of our partners, Adora, she pulled us aside and she said, "Hey, we really like you guys as founders, but we really don't think your idea is going to go anywhere." And I remember during the YC interview, they just kept drilling and drilling and drilling on like, who's using AR apps right now? Like, how many people in the world are using AR apps? What's the DAU of the entire market? And we just couldn't give a good answer. And they just kept asking. So actually during the interview, we thought we failed and we wouldn't get in. But we ended up getting in, and they really recommended that, like, hey, the timing might just be off from what we see. And mind you, this was the batch where they were accepting a lot of AR apps. And I think if you remember, like Brex, I think was probably a couple batches before us. I don't remember, but they were also an AR app at the beginning. And then basically all the AR companies pivoted at some point. It was pretty tough because as a first-time founder, your idea is kind of like your entire identity. So to our friends, to everyone else, we quit our jobs to be the AR guys. But you keep building this idea, you realize it's not really going anywhere. And what really distinguishes someone who's been doing this for a while versus someone who, it was our first year doing it, is the ability to pivot. Because you think, as an entrepreneur, you're not supposed to give up. You're supposed to keep going, fight to the end. You don't really think that you should choose your battles wisely. And I think I heard on a podcast recently that you can give a 10 out of 10 execution on a 2 out of 10 idea, and that's a waste of your time. So that's what we were doing. And about 4 or 5 weeks in, we actually decided to pivot. One huge mistake we made was that we didn't pivot cleanly the first time. So we were looking for new ideas, and then we'd go back and entertain our old, AR idea, and just kept going back and forth. And we basically wasted like 2 weeks, which in the grand scheme of things isn't a long time, but during YC is an eternity. That's like a quarter of the program. By the time we finally decided on a fitness idea, I think we were at first doing Twitch for fitness, just like live streaming fitness classes. Thought it was a good idea. I don't think so anymore, but at the time it seemed like a good idea. We had about 4 weeks left until demo day to build a product, get users, build a business, all that, and get ready to fundraise. So as you can imagine, when we got to demo day, we had a 4-week-old company, barely a product, basically just like a really nice demo. And so we were able to raise a little bit off of that, I think $175K. So that plus the YC money lasted us the next 2 years.
And this was before YC was doing the 500 with the MFN. So
yeah.
There was the 175 or something? Right.
I'm not familiar. Yeah, I think in total it was like 500 with an MFN note.
I think there's so many great nuggets there about how like you can't let go of your baby. You keep coming back to it, but that's really a bad strategy. That 10 and 2 example is such a great analogy of how many founders just won't let go, but also put the effort into the wrong focus areas. Was there something between, like, do you think if you were a solo founder, it would have been easier? Do you think because you also wanted to make sure you and your partner were in total agreement on decisions with such big, valuable, decisions that you both needed to agree on, was that a harder part of it?
I don't think I would have made it past month 2 if I were a solo founder, honestly.
Well, then that's the honest truth. That's good.
I think it would have been a lot harder.
So what was the aha moment though? Because you guys obviously had another pivot to where you got to now, which was Vimcal. Take us through that moment, that aha moment when the fitness idea was not going to make a big splash and you ended up landing on the idea for Vimcal.
The year after YC, when we were doing the fitness idea, I would say that was probably the lowest point, the darkest year, because one, we were running out of money, running out of time because we didn't raise that much. And two, we just tried so many things in the fitness space. So at first it was that live streaming fitness class idea we talked about. Really quickly realized how expensive that would be to run. And it wasn't for us. And then we tried a few other ideas, including like an app to help you relieve back pain, improve posture, kind of like a headspace for posture and back pain for desk workers. So we just tried a bunch of things. And I think what I'm really proud of looking back at is that we pivoted a lot within the space. So we treated everything more as experiments rather than like a life mission to make this thing work. That the AR idea was like a life mission, right? Whereas now all these I think we tried like 5 different mini companies within the fitness space during that year. Going back to when we first pivoted and then I had to fundraise during demo day, we had a lot of investor interest from demo day, even if, our idea was very young. I remember I had to schedule at one point 30 investor calls all at once, like in a given week. And that's just the mayhem of YC demo day. You have 2 choices when you schedule meetings. One is you send out a Calendly link, which takes care of a lot of things for you. And the second option is you do it manually, which is kind of the default. As you probably know, when you send out a Calendly link, there's this power dynamic. I'm asking them for money, but I'm also telling them to, pick a time at my leisure. So for a lot of reasons, a lot of people don't like to use, booking links when there's a clear power dynamic. So I made the mistake of doing everything manually. I remember one call at like 4 a.m. with an investor because he was in Asia. I double booked 2 or 3 calls and just made a lot of silly mistakes. And I didn't realize at the time that could be a startup idea because Calendly was the obvious dominant player. But it was just this thing in the back of my mind, like, oh, that was annoying. Or, I probably lost a deal because of scheduling. I tell myself that, probably not. But going through the whole journey with the fitness idea, and when it came to an end, our second pivot, we were a lot more, I would say, a lot more practical in how we looked for ideas. The number one rule that we set for ourselves that we didn't adhere to the first time was whatever product we end up choosing to build, we had to be users ourselves. So for the augmented reality company, for the fitness, multiple ideas that we use, we were never the end users. And that's why it was really hard to always figure out what should we build next? What should we release for the users? Because you always had to ask other people. And when things got hard, there was that level of like minor disconnect in interest. We're like, I'm not going to use this fitness app. Whereas the calendar was something as founders you're using like 40 times a day. You're opening that over and over again. You're scheduling all the time, all kinds of meetings. So we set a 2-week limit on exploring the calendar idea. We build out a little prototype, come up with ideas and brainstorm. And, that 2 weeks has turned to almost 5 years at this point, and we're still going. So
that's amazing. I love that philosophy of like, would we actually be users of the product ourselves? It's kind of like getting a job. Would you work for the founder or the CEO? Is a filter for whether or not you should go work for a new company. The other thing you didn't mention, which I've noticed and why I switched off Calendly, was that people were hacking into my calendar because they were figuring out the URL extension for my personal calendar. I had a calendar event pop up and I was like, how did this get booked? But I was like, all right, maybe I just sent it out by accident. And then I get on the call with the guy. I'm like, hey, how did you book this? He's like, oh, I just figured out the end of your URL. I had a couple options, kind of like when people, guess your email address. And I just wanted to prove that I can do this to get time with you and talk to you about another idea I'm working on and pitch you as a startup founder. I was like, well, that's brilliant, but also terrible from like a management of time perspective. So I switched off Calendly as well. So talk to us about when you had to talk, first off, to your investors probably a bit about fighting to go down the Vimcal path. And what were some of the biggest sort of fears and challenges you faced trying to get your supporters and, maybe if you had some employees at the time to believe in this new mission?
We were very lucky. At the time, we were just us two. So it was just my co-founder and me. So we didn't have any employees to really have to convince. Our investors, every single one of them up to this point, have always been amazing. We've never had, very lucky, knock on wood, but no problems with investors. And I think one reason is because we were pretty particular in choosing founders and operators most of the time for investors. And then when it came to funds, like the obviously really founder-friendly funds. And so they understand what it's like on their journey, and they understand that pivots happen. So these are people that have been through it. I would say the real pain and the scariest part was the fact that we were just so low on runway. When we decided to actually make the pivot, I think we had 7.5 months of runway, and we gave ourselves 30 days to build the prototype for Vimcal. And one thing we underestimated is how damn hard it is to build a calendar. It's a very visual tool. There's a lot of moving pieces. You don't see it. And it has to be live updated immediately, 24/7, because otherwise people miss their work meetings and they'll never trust your calendar again.
It's like your source of truth for your day. My wife laughs. I don't know my calendar until I look in the morning of.
Exactly. And if you think about it, your calendar is always 100% accurate at all times. Like you don't have any typos, you don't have any extra junk. It's not like your notes or your inbox where there's just a lot of stuff that doesn't matter, right? You can just dump things in there. Your calendar is pristine. And because of that, it has to be perfectly performant. There's very low tolerance for any mistakes. We were naive, so we didn't realize that until we actually started. And it actually took us 6 months to build the prototype. And by the time it was ready, it was, I think, like December 10th or something, right? And
so you're down to your last month and a half of capital.
Yeah. At that point, it was like the last few months. And then it was a week or two before Christmas. And as desperate as we weren't going to launch a work tool right before Christmas. So we waited until...
So there goes 2 weeks.
Yep, there goes 2 weeks. And I think we launched on January 20th or something the following year. And
wow.
Yeah, at that point, it was 50 days of runway. I remember... The day we pivoted was July 2019. We launched January 2020. Our money would have run out in March 2020. And we told ourselves, okay, we'll self-fund with the little bit of money we have until June. But we're not going past summer.
Talk about timing. I mean, COVID and remote work and all this sort of digital, software, management tools was just right place, right time. What was that first launch like? Tell us about it.
Yeah, we launched within the YC community and people loved it immediately. I think one thing we did right was we had a good one-liner. When we first launched, it was Superhuman for calendar. If you think about 2019, 2020, Superhuman was the tool du jour. Email's cousin is calendar. You kind of have to have both. So we launched the calendar version. And another thing I think that we did really well was or a decision we made that ended up paying off was I onboarded every new user over a 30-minute call. The reason we did that was not because we wanted to be like superhuman, but because we ran out of time to implement payments. So I would actually onboard people, show them the app, do my best to sell them and turn them into a power user. And then at the end of the call, if you want to keep using it, you have to put down your credit card, and I would send you a Stripe link, and I would watch you put the credit card in. And that went on for about 7 months until I did like over 1,000 calls, and I was like, okay, now it's time to hire someone else. So
that's true founder-led sales, really. I mean, like that is founder-led, and it's so important for you to also have that information of like how a good demo goes and what makes a bad demo. And yeah, I mean, kudos to you to getting people to put their credit card in right away. But I also read a funny moment where someone offered you $5,000 of investment versus a subscription payment. What was that about?
Good question. I didn't realize that founders, if they see a product they like, they'll ask to invest. I didn't realize that that could happen so often on calls. I remember I was just going through my spiel, the person really liked the product, and I asked them, hey, if you want to keep using the product, would you mind putting your credit card into the Stripe link? And they were like, all right, I'll do you one better. I really like the product, but I can only invest $5,000. Would you take a check from me instead? And I get to use the product for free. And I was like, yeah, 100%. That $5,000 bought us 2 months of runway.
What? That's hilarious. What?
That literally saved the company.
Come on.
Yeah.
That was in like March, I guess. You were just running out.
Yeah. And then I think like a week or two later, someone did the same thing and invested $150K. And that really saved the company. That's amazing. But the first $5K was like the stress reliever, right? Like we just bought ourselves runway through spring.
It's amazing. I mean, like fits perfectly with the superhuman analogy. I'm sure superhuman would love to have a Vimcal integration, if not already. But talk to us a little bit about sort of the journey since then. Obviously you've released some pretty cool AI features with the new Vimcal EA assistant. Talk to us about the journey, obviously, from getting, out of the trenches in 2020 and how the thing just really took off. Product-led growth, I'm sure, also helped a lot.
It really helps when you have a product that's just viral by nature. So with booking links, we are a scheduling product. Your users are advertising on your behalf every time they schedule with other people. So that helps. And then a few things that we've done that have really moved the needles include one, just building out a lot of team features. You don't schedule in a vacuum. You are scheduling with teammates. There's different combinations of people scheduling, like 2 people internally scheduling with 3 people externally, 10 people internally trying to schedule an offsite. Like there's all these complex cases. And that was always our motto, which is to go for the really difficult scheduling use cases. I think one thing that sets Vimcal apart from the other calendars or scheduling tools on the market is that we are going for the type of user that has a lot of calendar meetings, a lot of work meetings, and is basically like back-to-back on Zoom all day. Whereas a lot of the other products you'll see are more geared towards just daily planners or self-scheduling, like almost using your calendar as a to-do, which these are all things that you can do in Vimcal. But because we focus on the scheduling of actual meetings with other people, we can, 1, charge more than other competitors, and 2, we can build out a lot of multiplayer features. So entire teams will end up using Vimcal, and that's really helped our growth. And one of the great benefits that came out of onboarding so many users in the early days is that we learned very specifically what our ICPs were. So a lot of people think, ICPs are probably, superhuman type users or people that do X, Y, and Z. But we were able to get that very detailed. So one of our ICPs is people who have both Outlook and Google Calendar accounts. Because when you use Outlook, you can't see your Google calendars in it. And, people want their personal and their work next to each other. We would have never learned that if we didn't talk to our users. Another ICP was executive assistants. They have by far the most complex scheduling cases of any group out there because they are often scheduling on behalf of multiple busy executives. And these are high stake meetings with very high ego people, very low tolerance for mistakes. And you're like on call 24/7 as an EA. So we always knew after talking to so many people, a lot of them being EAs, that we would eventually build an EA product. And that's why we launched Vimcal EA about a year ago. And it turns out, that was one of the best decisions we've ever made, because EAs are underserved, they're underpaid, no one builds software for them. So when you go to them with a solution that you build custom made for them, they embrace you with open arms. And that has really helped driven our also team, the first part I talked about, the team features, because now the EA and the executives can use Vimcal together.
I mean, first off, just kudos to you for doing so many founder-led sales calls early on to really hone in on what it was that you were getting, pull from the market on, and then doubling down on that. And then figuring out the ICP, especially, when users were giving you high quality feedback and then incorporating that into a brand new product is so important for our listeners to understand why you can't offload this type of work to a BDR or a sales leader. You need to be, especially when you're involved in the product still, like it sounds like you obviously are with your co-founder all the time, you need to be on those calls, hearing and asking the questions in real time to get that amazing user feedback and engagement. But productivity tools are all over the place. It's a crowded space. It's competitive. How is Vimcal stacking up and trying to differentiate itself against obviously the industry giants? And, what are you encountering that is giving you confidence that you're going to be able to continue at the pace of growth that you've had for the last couple of years?
Because we target people with really complex scheduling cases, so business owners, founders, investors, those are some people that really like using Vimcal, and they tend to be the decision makers in their companies. Because we target them as usually patient zero in their company, when they start using a calendar, it then spreads throughout their organization. I think that's one thing that differentiates Vimcal from a lot of the other calendars or scheduling tools on the market. A lot of calendars tend to target like design Twitter, and because of that, they'll get designers or engineers onto their calendars, and that's fine too. But these aren't people with a lot of meetings or people that are usually willing to pay a lot for calendars. Whereas if you get the person who's in charge or leadership of an organization, then the tool tends to trickle down much more effectively to the rest of the team. I think who we focus on is as important as what we're building in terms of differentiation.
It's really nice to hear you say we're not just competing on price. In fact, you're doing the opposite, right? And the focusing on the users versus the buyers is something we tell our founders all the time. How have you thought about going after the users and buyers differently in your go-to-market strategy?
Yeah, so it's very interesting because with the Vimcal EA, to the buyer, it's so obvious. No one's ever built a calendar for EAs. That's like saying no one's ever built Photoshop for photographers, right? Like this is a power tool. They're in 70% of their day and they work like 60, 70 hours a week. So they spend a lot of time in the calendar scheduling, rescheduling. There is a small discrepancy between the buyer and the user. The good thing about the EA product, for example, is that the EA usually works for someone who has a lot of pull, almost always. I would say we have to take a smaller leap between the buyer and like IT or the person making the decision, because usually, if they schedule for the CEO is like, yep, just talk to IT and I'm okay with it if they're okay with it. Who your user is also matters. And I think here we got lucky that the EA, is someone that is a very small step removed from the decision maker.
I mean, you've got some pretty exciting power users out there. I heard you had a pretty unique encounter with a fan at a concert. Can you share that story with us?
I was at the Brooklyn Mirage, which is this concert venue in New York. I was with some friends, and this guy, like 3 rows ahead, just kept turning back and looking at me. And I was very confused at first because I wasn't sure if he was looking at me or looking at someone behind me or one of my friends. And then eventually he comes up to me and he said, "Hey, are you John Lee from Vimcal?" And I said, "Yeah, did we meet somewhere before?" And he's like, "Oh, dude, I got to show you something." And mind you, we're in a crowd of like, I don't know, 5,000, however many thousand people. It's dark. The music's blasting. Everyone's facing the stage and his back is to the stage. He's facing me and he just pulls down his pants like to the ankles and he points down, where it's dark, and he's like, "Look." And I'm like, what do you want me to look at? And then he's like, shine your iPhone light. And I shine my light onto his legs, and I see something pink, and he's like, look closely. So I actually leaned down like near his crotch.
Oh my God.
And it's a Vimcal logo. This guy, this stranger, got a Vimcal logo tattooed on his right thigh, I believe, and proceeded to strip in front of me and show me. And I did not mind after that. That was one of the best moments of the last 6 years.
It was a permanent tattoo.
It was a permanent tattoo, and it was his first tattoo.
What?
Yeah.
Why?
We joked that this guy's our honorary CMO for the rest of Vimcal's life.
Maybe he had a pet named Vimcal and it just coincidentally lined up with your name. Come on. No one does that for a startup calendar software tool.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good sign.
That's awesome. That is one of the greatest stories I've ever heard. Okay. Wow. We'll try to move on from that. So, it took 11 months and I read 181 investor meetings to secure your last round of funding. What a grueling process. And I'm sure it obviously was something you learned a lot from your prior days of running the fitness company. But you ended up raising $4.5 million from a great lead, Altos Ventures. You've got some great backers, including obviously YC, Airbnb co-founder Joe Gebbia, and former Twitter CEO Dick Costello, and a bunch of others, as well as Hustle Fund. So, with now 6.9 million total raised, tell us about that 11-month grueling process first off. And how have the stories and the pivots along the way helped you in fundraising?
Yeah, the stories and pivoting have really helped. I think that more so shows resilience, and it's evidence that if things get tough, we're not just going to call it quits. If we've been through that, we can probably deal with whatever else is coming down the line. So I think that's kind of the importance of storytelling of your journey. And every entrepreneur, doesn't matter how long you've been doing this or how short you've been doing this, you have some story. You just have to bring it out of yourself and share it with people. Raising in 2021 and 2023, I think it's obvious, but it was night and day difference. So in 2021, we raised a small pre-seed, a $1.9 million pre-seed. So that's when we had, Hustle Fund, Joe Gebbia, and everyone joined the round. And then 2023, we went out to raise a proper seed round. So we're going to do somewhere between 3 and 5 million proper seed round. And that was at the bottom of the market, whereas that pre-seed was at the tip top of the market. The pre-seed took 3 days. I had raised about $700K through the calls over a 7-month period. Just same story as before. At the end of the call, the person would ask, hey, can I invest? And that happened 20 times probably. So 700K came that way. And then the rest of the 1.2 I raised basically in a weekend. This time around, it took 11 months to get a lead investor basically to close out the round. I would say part of it was because it's a different round. Depending on the round, you have to show different, points of evidence. In the pre-seed, I would focus entirely on your demo and trying to make that as attractive and add all the wow factors that you can into your demo. When it comes to the seed, especially in this current market condition, you really have to focus on proof of traction. By that, I mean, you have to show that you have been growing at a high rate leading up to the fundraise. Not just that, you will grow, you project you'll grow. You have to go into the investor meeting saying, hey, look at my last 3 months, look at my last 6 months, look at this big growth number. We're going to keep that going. What people want in a bull market and a bear market are very different. In a bear market, they're, obviously they don't want to lose their investment. So they care more about what the Excel sheet looks like. Whereas, the numbers, the specific traction numbers. Whereas in a bull market, I hate to say this, but a lot of them are going off vibes and just seeing who else is investing. The FOMO meter is very high because everyone's getting into all kinds of deals. So that focus, I know a lot of people that tried to raise in 2023 the same way they tried to raise in 2021, and they just basically wasted like 30 investor meetings, 50 investor meetings because they didn't, change their strategy.
Totally. I mean, numbers don't lie nowadays, and people are just focusing back to the basics of like how to build a real business, which is good. And we make sure our companies, especially the pre-seed companies that we lead, are very well aware of how hard the seed rounds and Series A rounds are. So I appreciate your self-awareness. I also heard that references played a pretty crucial role in your due diligence process. How'd you go about gathering those, and what can you tell other founders out there about how important references are?
References are, I would say, one of the most important parts of the process. I remember there was one investor where I was really gung-ho about, and I was like, I think we got to the partner meeting, and I told Mike, my co-founder, hey, I think they're the ones. And then I looked at their portfolio page, and one of our angel investors was one of their portfolio companies, and also one of their founder friends was also a portfolio company. So I asked our investor, hey, what do you know about these people? Like, are they great? Like, we're really looking forward to meeting with them and working with them. And they're like, we had a good experience, but you should talk to this other person. And then I talked to the other person. So this was like one level removed, this founder that I don't know. And it turned out that when a key employee left, this fund did something shady with the equity and all that, and it made the founder's journey really hard. So if I hadn't made those calls, that could have been us.
I honestly couldn't agree more. In fact, when we are talking with founders and they ask us what do we do and our value add and all that, I said, don't even ask me that question, because every VC is going to give you something that's positive. Just go on our portfolio page and reach out to any founders asking to talk to them and see how it goes. Because one, our founders tell us when they've been reached out to, and we say, yeah, of course, we're talking to them. Have a good call, not influencing it. But I think it's really important for all founders out there to make sure they talk to those references, especially when you're getting into a 10-year partnership with these investors. So I appreciate that. One of the hot topics, obviously, the main hot topic is AI and how it's impacting a lot of software tools. I call it a tool, obviously not its own platform. How are you thinking about AI's role in your specific industry, and how are you using it to kind of shape the future of scheduling and obviously calendar apps?
I actually have a pretty controversial view about AI and calendars. Having been in this space for a long time, one thing that I've learned is scheduling is a very human problem to be solved, not a software problem to be solved. So one thing you're going to start seeing, and you probably already have seen, you've probably been pitched this, is AI assistant that will just automatically schedule on behalf of the end user. So this could be like, CCing my AI scheduler, or a Chrome extension that just replies for you, whatever it is. And I think that all those companies and products will learn the same lesson, which is, again, you can't go the last mile in scheduling with an AI tool. There has to be some kind of human. And by human, I mean you, the end user, who has to make that final decision. And that's because a calendar, what's marked on it, what's not marked on it, is not actually the final source of truth, right? Maybe you had a text from your wife saying, hey, can you pick up the kids next Friday at 3 p.m.? And you didn't put that in your calendar, which is a very regular use case, right? Like, you're not always on top of it. Your calendar isn't 100% reflective of what your life is like. But the software doesn't know that. So even if the AI is 100% accurate, it might still put a meeting there, and then you're going to have to reschedule it. And if you remember what I said earlier, in that people have a very low tolerance for mistakes in the calendar app. One mistake, they miss a meeting, okay, maybe they'll forgive you. Two, like, they're done with you. The problem with those types of meetings being scheduled by an AI is that if even one meeting is scheduled at a suboptimal time, the person's just going to stop using the app. And the more people on that meeting, the higher the stake of the meeting, and the higher the likelihood of misscheduling by an AI. So what ends up happening that you'll see is people start using these AI schedulers for all types of meetings. And then eventually they stop using it for the important meetings. And then eventually they stop using it for meetings with anyone else on it externally. And then eventually maybe they only use it for internally. And then eventually it's only for like your to-do. Right? And that's always the steps. The way to bypass this is to ask the person, hey, here are the 3 options, click one. But at that point, you might as well schedule it yourself. So I think that AI will not solve scheduling completely. But what AI can do in the context of calendaring is it can do tasks for you that an executive assistant would do. So for example, one of the things that Vimcal does for you with AI that an EA usually does is it will prepare dossiers of the people you're about to meet with. I have a meeting with you, and before this meeting, if I go to my calendar, I will see your social links. I will see an AI summary of your company, and that will be true of everyone on this invite. And I have that for every single meeting that I have on my calendar. There are so many more examples of this, but these are the ways that I think AI can really assist you in the calendar context, not specifically just the scheduling portion.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I always say this. So we have an EA, I have an EA, and so does my partner, and we live by them. And I think that the roles that they solve are very contextual and very specific for the situations. For example, my partner is traveling overseas in Asia right now, coordinating both our calendars and meetups and things like that is very complicated. And you can't just look at simple openings in the calendar and time zones. The other thing that I think, EAs and just a normal person needs to be involved in is exactly time boxing certain things between personal and professional, and then coordinating that with all the other parties involved. So I agree with you that AI is great at the summarization piece and maybe providing some recommendations, but taking full action from beginning to end is a very risky thing, because we all know time is the most valuable commodity in our lives, and giving that up to AI to totally run the show on. If one of the meetings is misbooked, your entire day could be thrown off. And we know what happens, at the end of the day, if you have a bunch of meetings off, your first one starts just 5-10 minutes late, and then everything else gets thrown off. And by the end of the day, you're exhausted.
Yeah, it's a domino effect. That's why we also recommend people not to do too many back-to-backs. There's a happy medium.
I'll remember that next time I book my days. What can people expect from you and the Vimcal team over the next few years? You guys have been on a roll, over the last few years, and really exciting updates. What can we expect over the next few years to see from you and the team?
We're really going to expand our team features. So that's on 2 fronts. One is internal scheduling. When you look at your coworkers' calendars, when you schedule with them, if they're in a different time zone, or if it's multiple internal people meeting with an external party, we're going to make all those cases just a lot easier and remove points of friction. And then the second part is on the external scheduling. So we're building out team booking links, round robin links, and just really expanding what you can do as a team scheduling with people outside the organization.
Fantastic. So many exciting things. Before we wrap things up, we always ask our guests for their fast favorites. So first off, your favorite podcast.
I would say my favorite podcast is My First Million. I really like that the hosts focus on copywriting, and they're really good copywriters. And that's something that I personally really like. So the words they choose to describe things are just chef's kiss.
You think a lot of it's AI?
I think it's all in the brains.
Next is your favorite newsletter or blog.
Yeah, I've been following James Clear since I was 2014. So I really like to read his newsletters and his book as well, Atomic Habits. It's great.
Not familiar with it. What does he write about usually?
Productivity. But he, again, writes very well. So I think I like the writing almost as much as the tips that he gives. I really liked writing and copywriting, good copywriting.
Sounds like it. Next is your favorite tech gadget?
My sous vide, which is the cooking device that perfectly controls water temperature and it allows me to cook perfect medium rare steaks with, I think, 10 minutes of prep. No
bother making it in a plastic bag.
In a plastic bag, yeah. And then I will let it cook for an hour.
No, but it doesn't bother you that you're cooking your food in a plastic bag?
No, because it's a freezer bag. So it's meant to deal with really high or low temperatures.
What have you made recently in it that you loved?
Perfectly juicy chicken. And my go-to is always steak. And recently I made a bison steak that was just delicious.
Honestly, I would love to give it a try, but my wife would kill me if I bought another food gadget. I have too many of them. Next is your favorite new trend?
I don't know if this is a trend or a consequence of COVID, but what I've seen is more people in their 20s spend a long amount of time living at home with their parents, especially in the last few years. I think that's just overall better for everyone. I did that. A lot of my friends did that. It's obviously great for the parents, for family. I think it's just great for society in general. And, for most of the world, that is the norm, to live at home until you're married. Most people I know got 5% more family oriented because of COVID. And, it was just nice to see.
Now, I wonder if the parents would feel the same way about having the
I feel
kids
like
in
most
all
of them
too
are
long.
happy.
Hopefully, yes. Next is your favorite book?
I really liked reading Animal Farm.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I've read that so long ago. How often have you read it?
I've read it twice, but a long time ago. It just changes the way you see everything. Every company, every organization, religion, government, whatever, is just, you're seeing it at one point in time, and anything that's good can become bad and vice versa.
It's a classic, and the first time I think it's been mentioned on the podcast. So thanks for sharing it. And last but not least, your favorite life lesson.
The thing about running your own company is that everything you do is very high stakes, from high level strategies to picking the perfect shade of purple for a button, right? Everything just seems like it's the most important thing. And because of that, as like founders, you get triggered by everything, and you get triggered like 5-6 times a day. I don't know if it's a lesson, but the best thing that's happened to me is going through this and just learning how to deal with each of these like emotional triggers on a daily basis over time. And I think just looking at how I react to things now versus 3-4 years ago, I'm just a completely different person. And I think that's one of the benefits of executive coaching, is basically to talk with someone and have a professional help you deal with all these triggering moments day in and day out. And so if any founders that are considering it, I would highly recommend it.
Yeah, I mean, the emotional, visceral reactions we see founders having to the smallest things, about not responding to an email on time, or the way that emails are completely taken out of context sometimes, is so hard to hear. But that's our job, obviously, as pre-seed investors, to be almost like a therapist for our founders. So I appreciate you sharing that. And thanks so much for jumping in the tank today with co-founder and CEO of Vimcal, John Lee.
Thank you so much, Matt. This was really fun.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Tank Talks. We hope you found today's conversation as insightful as we did. If you're enjoying the show, we've got 3 quick things to ask of you. First, hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or YouTube. Next, follow us and stay up to date on upcoming episodes and behind-the-scenes content on social media with Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And lastly, share the love. If you found value in today's episode, share with a friend or colleague who'd benefit too. Your support helps us bring in more amazing guests and keeps the Tank Talks engine running. That's it for today. Until next time, keep disrupting and innovating.